All right, let's dive in, shall we? Today, it's the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. We've got a really interesting mix of sources lined up for you today. Um, Audio clips from a history podcast we found, even a few of the old ads that they played, plus a couple of historical accounts that really paint a vivid picture of the whole thing. And trust me, it's a story you won't soon forget. So we're going to uncover the events leading up to this disaster, of course. But more importantly, I think we're going to look at the decisions and policies that made it so much worse than it had to be.
You know, one thing that often gets overlooked about this flood is that it wasn't just an act of nature, right? It was the culmination of human choices, decisions made about land use, flood control, even social structures that really turned a natural event into a complete catastrophe.
Okay, so let's start in the Mississippi Delta. Incredibly fertile land, shaped by the Mississippi River, everyone knows that. But of course, that also makes it incredibly vulnerable to flooding. Before the Civil War, white planters, like the Percy family, built their wealth on this land, using enslaved labor, obviously. And then after the war, that system shifted to sharecropping.
And that shift to sharecropping is really key
Yeah.
because, while it wasn't slavery outright, it basically locked black laborers into this cycle of debt and dependence on white landowners. So when the flood hit, they had very little power to protect themselves or their families.
Right, so we've got this inherently vulnerable region. Right, and then
Right.
enter the levees-only policy for flood control. So the Mississippi River Commission, mostly Army engineers back then, they basically pushed forward with this approach, even though civilian engineers were warning them it was a huge risk.
Yeah, there's this real sense of overconfidence at the time, almost a belief they could completely control the river.
Yeah.
General Lansing Beach, he was a member of the commission. He actually said he'd rather blow a hole in a levee than build a spillway.
Talk about unintended consequences, huh?
Wow, so they're doubling down on this potentially flawed approach.
Yeah,
At
but
the same time, we have someone like Leroy Percy, powerful planter and senator in the Delta. Now, he was considered progressive, opposed the KKK, and even acknowledged that his cotton empire relied on black labor. But wasn't there a fundamental contradiction in his position?
Absolutely. His story really highlights the complexities of the South during that period. Even those considered progressive were often, deeply embedded in systems that perpetuated racial and economic inequality.
Okay, so we've got a recipe for disaster brewing here. A vulnerable region, a questionable flood control policy, and deep-seated social inequalities. Then in 1926, the rain starts. And not just any rain, we're talking. Relentless, record-breaking rain across the whole Mississippi River watershed. And it wasn't just the amount of rain, it was the pattern, Heavy rains followed by more storms, then blizzards, even tornadoes. It was this constant battering that just overwhelmed the entire river system.
So the Mississippi River starts to rise, and quickly. Towns along the river, they know they're in trouble. They need all hands on deck to reinforce the levees. But who do they force into this dangerous work?
Black men. They were pulled away from their jobs, their families, forced to work on the levees in terrible conditions, often with armed guards threatening them if they tried to leave. There's this gut-wrenching story of a shoe repairman from Greenville literally dragged from his shop to work on the levee. Can you imagine the fear and desperation?
It's hard to fathom. And it seems like the inherent inequalities of sharecropping basically sealed their fate. They had the least control over flood prevention, yet they were the most vulnerable to its consequences.
Exactly. It wasn't just about the flood itself. It was about who had the power to protect themselves and who didn't. And that power dynamic was deeply rooted in the social and economic structures of the time.
Okay, so the tension is building, right? Everyone knows the levees are strained to the breaking point.
Sure.
There's one spot in particular that has everyone on edge. Mound Landing.
Mound Landing was a critical point because that's where the Arkansas and White Rivers merge with the Mississippi. And to make matters worse, the river takes a sharp bend right there, putting immense pressure on that section of the levee.
You've got the confluence of three rivers, all swollen from the record rainfall, all pushing against the levee at a sharp bend. And on top of that, you have these black men essentially forced into a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to hold back this massive force of nature. I mean, what type of levee was even there? Were there known flaws in its construction?
Well, it was a typical earthen levee of the time, but what made Mound Landing particularly vulnerable was the combination of that sharp bend in the river and the confluence of three major rivers. It created a perfect storm, so to speak. And remember, the Mississippi was already at times its normal volume. So the levee at Mound Landing was essentially a bottleneck, holding back an unimaginable amount of water.
Okay, so it's April 21st, 1927. The levee at Mound Landing finally gives way. It's a breach 3/4 of a mile wide, and the volume of water released was double that of Niagara Falls. This wall of water is now rushing south, straight towards Greenville.
The sound must have been deafening, the force unimaginable. This wasn't just a flood, it was a complete rupture of the landscape, and anyone caught in its path had very little chance of escape.
So we've got this catastrophic levee break, and the floodwaters are bearing down on Greenville. But before we get into that, let's take a quick step back and listen to one of the ads that played during the original podcast. It'll give you a sense of what life was like back then, just as this disaster was about to unfold.
You know, it's fascinating how those old ads, even though they're just snippets, really, they give us a glimpse into the everyday lives and concerns of people back then. It's a reminder that history isn't just about major events. It's about the lives of, ordinary people.
Exactly. And in this case, those ordinary lives were about to be turned upside down. So the floodwaters are racing towards Greenville, and people are starting to panic. There's this account of a family in Greenville, a teacher and a dentist, who are just agonizing over whether to flee or not. They're watching their neighbors running, hearing the wind howling, and you can almost feel the terror rising.
Yeah, it's that uncertainty that's so terrifying, isn't it? That, do you stay and risk being trapped, or do you abandon your home and everything you own? And for Black families, that choice was even more fraught with danger. I mean, they were facing not only the flood, but also the potential violence of white authorities.
Right, and to make matters worse, communication was so limited back then. News traveled slowly.
Yes.
And even if you knew the flood was coming, you wouldn't know exactly when or how bad it would be. Imagine the chaos and confusion.
Oh, it was just people were desperate, fleeing to the courthouse, climbing onto rooftops, anything to escape the rising water. But those who could afford to leave, mostly white families, of course, they were crowding onto trains, leaving those without resources behind.
And meanwhile, the Percy family is facing their own crisis. Leroy and his son, Will. They're frantically trying to secure aid, transportation, anything to save their town and their cotton empire. Seems like a huge burden of responsibility on their shoulders. What do you make of their actions during this time?
Well, it's interesting because Leroy Percy had this reputation for being somewhat progressive on race. But in this moment of crisis, his actions seem to prioritize the safety and well-being of his own family and their economic interests. It really raises questions about the limits of individual good intentions within a system built on inequality.
Okay, so the flood hits Greenville, and it's not a sudden crashing wave, but a relentless rising tide that slowly swallows the town. Homes, businesses, everything underwater. And ironically, those levees they worked so hard to build actually made things worse.
That's right, because the levees slowed the floodwaters down. So instead of a quick surge that might have receded quickly, the water lingered, causing more damage and making rescue efforts incredibly difficult.
So now, you have hundreds of thousands of people displaced, many left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and it's no surprise that Black communities were hit the hardest.
Absolutely. They were forced into segregated refugee camps, where the conditions were horrific. There are accounts from journalists describing the stench of sewage, the cries of hungry children. It was a humanitarian crisis on top of a natural disaster.
And it's yet another example of how those pre-existing inequalities just get amplified during a crisis. It's like the flood exposed the cracks in society that were already there.
Yeah.
Even the relief efforts were slow and inadequate, with Black communities receiving far less support than white communities.
That's right. And it wasn't just a local issue. The scale of this disaster forced President Coolidge to act. He mobilized federal resources for relief and recovery. It became a defining moment of his presidency.
All right.
And it really put the issue of flood control on the national stage.
So here we are, left with this image of the Delta underwater, a region utterly transformed by the power of nature and the consequences of human choices. The physical damage was immense, of course, but the social and economic scars were even deeper, weren't they?
Absolutely. And what's really striking is that those scars, those patterns of inequality and vulnerability, they're still evident today. The legacy of the Great Mississippi Flood continues to shape the social and economic landscape of the region.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this deep dive. It's not just a history lesson. It's a reminder that the choices we make, the systems we create, have long-lasting consequences. We can't separate natural disasters from the social and economic context in which they occur.
Exactly. And that leads us to some important questions, right? Like, how do we balance economic progress with environmental responsibility? How do we ensure that disaster response is equitable and just? These are questions we're still grappling with today. And the Great Mississippi Flood serves as a powerful reminder of what's at stake.
It's really hard to wrap our minds around the sheer scale of suffering. All those lives uprooted, the families scattered, the generational trauma inflicted by this flood. Even when the water receded, the devastation lingered.
And the recovery process,
Yeah.
sadly, mirrored the same inequalities that, magnified the flood's impact in the first place. Black families, already starting from a position of disadvantage, struggled to rebuild their lives. They were often denied access to the same resources and aid that white families received. It's like, in a way, the flood solidified those existing power structures and deepened the racial divide in the Delta.
It's just a tragic illustration of how disasters don't just create hardship.
Yeah.
They often expose and exacerbate existing social injustices.
Mm.
But even amidst all that devastation, there were glimmers of hope, right? Stories of
Yeah.
resilience, of communities coming together to help each other survive.
Oh, absolutely. In the face of unimaginable loss, we see countless acts of courage and compassion. Uh, Black residents, despite bearing the brunt of the disaster, often played a vital role in rescue efforts, saving lives, sharing what little food and shelter they had. These stories of human kindness, of shared humanity amidst such hardship, they're a powerful counterpoint to the narratives of exploitation and neglect.
Yeah, it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there's this potential for connection, for solidarity. It's a testament to the human spirit. So, as we reach the end of our deep dive, what are the key takeaways here? What can we learn from this catastrophic event?
Well, the Great Mississippi Flood stands as a stark cautionary tale, I think. It reveals the limits of human control over nature, that levees only policy, driven by a belief that we could dominate the river, ultimately backfired. It created conditions for an even more devastating flood. It underscores the need for humility in our relationship with the environment, for recognizing the interconnectedness of natural systems. We can't control nature, but we can learn to work with it, to respect its power.
And it also highlights the human cost of ignoring warnings, right? Those in power. They prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term sustainability and social equity. And as a result, everyday people, especially those who are already marginalized, paid the price.
Exactly. This deep dive wasn't just about uncovering the events of the flood, but about understanding its complexities, its long-lasting consequences, and it's a call to action. As we face new challenges, from climate change to social inequalities, we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. We have to strive for a more just and sustainable future.
We can't change history, that's for sure. But we can learn from it. As you reflect on the story of the Great Mississippi Flood, consider this. How do we balance economic progress with environmental responsibility and social equity in the face of future challenges? What choices can we make today to build a more resilient and just world for everyone? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.